Hi Dragonflies, welcome back to Dragonfly Spirit Studio. I'm Lynn Bauer. Every year around New Year's, I have some form of this same conversation with multiple people. Someone will contact me and they'll say, my New Year's resolution this year is to get to the point where I'm not just doing paint-alongs or copying photos with a few editorial changes, I'm actually creating my own original paintings. But I'm not ready yet. And then they'll list a bunch of technical skills that they think they need to learn before they start learning to design their own paintings. Like, I need to learn to paint water or clouds or trees or feather or furs or lay better washes or mix my colors. I hope to convince you in this video that the best time to start learning to design your own original paintings is right now, with whatever skills you happen to have, even if you just picked up a brush for the first time today. And I'm going to give you 3 simple strategies you can use to start designing simple paintings of your own and to start building 3 skills that all watercolor painters need to have to design their own paintings. To create a painting of your own design, you need more than just technical skills. You need to figure out things like, where do I get ideas for paintings? And how do I figure out what I really want to express with this painting or what I want to showcase? And then you have to figure out, how do I translate that into the language of colored marks on a piece of paper? And then how am I going to organize this whole process in space and time? How will I arrange the marks on the page? And how will I figure out what to do first and then what to do after that? And after you get all that figured out, you get down to applying your technical skills. How am I going to make the kind of marks that I want to make on this paper? So unfortunately, learning more and more and more technical skills doesn't really get you any farther along on all of these other things that help you design a painting of your own. So today I want to offer you 3 simple strategies that you can use to start designing paintings of your very own that are simple but pleasing and effective. And these aren't just gimmicks, they're also exercises that help you start to develop 3 fundamental design and planning skills that every watercolorist needs to have. How to combine things into larger shapes, how to plan where you need to reserve lights and whites in your paintings, and how to use your brushes more efficiently and effectively by using brush marks to suggest things instead of always drawing shapes and filling them in with color. So let's get started with the first strategy. I call this planning tool silhouette paintings. The purpose of this exercise is to learn to see more easily where you can combine things together into larger shapes. But if you're new to watercolor, you might be wondering, well, why would I want to do that in the first place? Combining shapes in less important areas makes those areas less busy and distracting, so the viewer spends more time looking at the things that we really want to showcase in the painting. And it makes the planning and the painting process simpler. In this scene, suppose you want the emphasis to be mostly on the water. Then it might not be necessary to paint each individual tree and all that clutter in the foreground. So you might treat the sky as one shape, the distant mountains gathered together as another shape, and then another shape for the hills, one for the trees on the far shore, the gravel bars, and then the foreground weeds. Now, you wouldn't necessarily fill each of these shapes with solid, flat color as I've done here. I did that so you could see them more easily. But you could, and that tells you that the viewer can interpret the scene without any of those details within these larger shapes. So how much detail you put in those shapes is really a matter of taste. So in this little sketch, there are several shapes that are clumps of trees or clumps of grasses or shrubs with some color variation and maybe a few suggestions of trunks or branches to give that overall impression that there are multiple trees. This painting has quite a bit more detail, but now that you're clued into what's going on, maybe you can see that there actually are some large shapes that have just a suggestion of detail within them. So the sky is one shape, that distant hill is another, all the trees on the far shore and those little islands were painted as one large yellow-green shape, and then some trunks and some shadows and so forth were put in to help them feel like they were multiple trees. The entire foreground meadow was one yellow-green shape that had some spattering and some brush marks made on top of it to kind of give the illusion of more detail, but it really all hangs together as one big shape. So I hope by now you're looking at this and thinking, oh yeah, I could probably kind of do that. But putting together a group of trees that are similar or a clump of grasses is a lot easier than figuring out what to do with a scene like this or like this. Now what? Well, if the foreground boats are your main subject, you might collect things into larger shapes, something like this. Because remember, we don't have to paint those shapes as one solid color. We can allow some variation within them and still keep things a little bit more pushed into the background so that the viewer's attention is more in the foreground. And so that the process of creating the painting is simplified quite a bit. This is a big help, especially when you're painting on location. Maybe I don't capture every detail, but I capture enough to get a sense of the scene, and a lot of the details I don't capture are things that I could invent and add later, if I feel like that adds something to what I want to say with this painting. Okay, so being able to group things into shapes is going to help us to reduce distractions and also make our task of planning and painting faster and easier, if we can figure out which things we can collect together into shapes. I know when I was trying to learn this, it always made perfect sense when someone else did it, but then when I had to do it, I couldn't decide where I should draw those boundaries. So this exercise is going to simplify that question for you. We're going to draw them as big as we possibly can. Okay, let's start with something not quite so complicated, but this one isn't as straightforward as that first one with the mountain and the river. There are a lot of different ways that we might group things together into larger shapes here, but it's not as obvious which groupings would be the best to use. So we're going to simplify the decision process to the biggest grouping that we can possibly make that's still a recognizable silhouette. In this case, it's this. Now, we've lost information about the setting and the exact nature of the building, but it's still quite clear that this is a lighthouse. And we've answered the question of how we're going to group things into larger shapes here. In this case, one big shape, or two if you count the sky. And we've dramatically simplified the task of creating this painting. Now, I know this doesn't look very exciting yet, but stick with me, because now we're going to get creative. Look what happens if I put a dark purple sky behind it. Now this looks kind of mysterious, and you can imagine this being a really interesting painting if I added some spattered masking for stars or put a little moon in there. Or maybe my imagination just starts to run wild and I put a little light inside the building and I light the lighthouse. Now, I might be getting a little carried away at this point, but now I'm really designing my own painting, and I'm in a really different place creatively than I would be if I just decided I'm going to paint this lighthouse from this photo. If I were going to do that, I immediately get wrapped up in things like, how am I going to do the trees? How am I going to do all those stones in the building? How am I going to draw all this? In other words, I've jumped immediately to wrestling with a whole lot of technical details without even asking myself, well, what do I want this painting to be about? What would make an interesting painting using this lighthouse as a subject? We'll come back to the daytime scene in a moment when we talk about the second strategy, but let's finish up with our silhouette painting. So this version is a bit crazy. There's too much going on here, but you could use any one of these lights and make an interesting painting. But if you're a beginner, even that might be a little bit of a challenge because you might not be familiar with how to reserve those light areas or use masking fluid, or you might be traveling and you don't have any masking fluid with you. So here's what I usually do with these, especially when I am traveling. One really small change from this very basic setup to something that's actually a pretty appealing postcard or painting is to put a graded wash behind it and then use another graded wash going in a different direction on the lighthouse. So that might look something like this. I have this dark purple, and I actually have my lighthouse drawing upside down right now. This is the bottom that I'm starting on because I'm going to want that dark in the end, so I may as well start laying my graded wash there kind of dark. And then when I get to the point where I would be at the horizon, I start bringing in this pink. And I'm going to keep going with the pink for a while, and then I'm going to switch back to my purple. So what this is going to do is give me a pale pink at the horizon and then a dark top to the sky and dark shadows below. And then when my sky wash is dry, I'm going to come back with darker colors, but I'm starting with sort of a magenta color at the top. And then as I work my way down, I'm going to add more of the purple. So this sort of winds up suggesting that there might still be a little light hitting the upper part of the lighthouse and the building. And you could leave it like that, or you could go back and add just a few shadow shapes to give it a little bit of form. The value of this exercise is being able to see how little information you really have to give the viewer if you have a nice recognizable silhouette. One thing you're going to notice when you start doing this exercise with lots of different scenes is that sometimes it's easy to figure out how to combine things into one large silhouette. Other times it's pretty hard to see how to do it. And that's okay, because that's part of the point of this exercise, is helping you learn to identify when you have a subject that's going to be fairly easy to work with and when you have one that's going to be really challenging. So you can start learning the planning process with something that's not quite so crazy as this one. But just because a scene is kind of busy doesn't mean it couldn't be used this way, because remember, you don't have to take everything in the scene and put it in your painting. So in this scene, you might choose to take your combined shape to be simply the figure and do a silhouette of the figure in some other setting. If you find it intimidating to put figures in your paintings, it can be a real relief to discover that often you don't really need much more than the silhouette and maybe a few suggestions of shadows. This figure uses some negative painting to define where the silhouette is, but the principle is the same. The reason we can recognize what this is that it is a recognizable silhouette. There are a few small brush strokes to suggest some of the features in the face and head, but you really wouldn't need them to know that it's a human figure. Starting off with the simplest big shape you can find, and then maybe adding a little bit more detail or breaking things up a little bit more, allows you to slowly develop the ability to see where you can combine things into shapes, and then add more details later if that suits your style and personality, or leave it very loose and abstract if that's more your thing. If you start simple with this and add complications a little at a time, you can learn the planning process and go a long way towards designing paintings of your own with this one strategy. But there is one place where you may run into trouble trying to apply this strategy, and that's figuring out how to reserve your light or white areas. In this painting, all the trees on the distant shoreline and islands were painted as one yellow-green wash, and then the shadow areas were painted around them. But sometimes it's hard to know whether you're going to be able to get away with something like that. So our second strategy is going to be to do a planning draft where we include opaque paint if necessary. To see how we can use this with the previous strategy, let's have a look again at our lighthouse and imagine that this time we want to paint it in the daytime, more or less as it is here in the photo. So we could begin more or less as we did with our nighttime scene, lay our sky wash, and then come back and lay a wash over the entire silhouette, where instead of a graded wash, this time we're going to allow our colors to change But we're going to just keep going wet into wet, and we're not going to divide it up into things yet. We're going to keep it one big shape. Now, this is a planning draft, so if I'm not sure how to handle a light area, I simply ignore it. Or if I'm not sure if I want to include it, like that little white shed. I don't know if I like that, it kind of distracts. So I'm just going to leave it out for now. After I finish this first large shape, I'm going to ask myself what's the most important thing for me to add next for whatever story I want to tell. So maybe I want my lighthouse to have some form. So if you squint your eyes, you can see that there is a large dark shape on the left side made up of the shadows on the end of the house and the lighthouse and the dark metal parts of the lighthouse itself. So perhaps I'll add that next. And maybe I want that shadow under the eaves and the window shapes. Now, it's a planning draft, so I'm not worrying terribly much about getting my drawing right, but I want to just point out here that you can always add more pencil marks as you go along if you decide you need some planning marks to show you where you want to put your next shape. So let's say I've decided I want to add more red to the roof, and I want to add that dark shadow shape and the shadow under the eaves and a suggestion of the windows. So now I've added the shapes I was pretty sure I wanted to add, but I'm not sure about the green shutters and the little shed, and I'm not sure what I want to do with the foreground. But this is a planning draft, so I just go ahead and try some stuff. So at this point, I kind of like the foreground a little simpler, but I'm thinking I might possibly want some lighter colored rocks in there. And I did decide to add the red roof of the shed, so I'm going to have to get my shed in there somehow. So at this point, we're going to bring in some opaque paint so that we can put lighter color on top of darker color, just for planning purposes. And one tip, if you've got an area that you think you might like as is, take a picture in case you make some changes and then think, no, I wish I would have left it the way it was. So you don't need a whole collection of opaque paints. All you need is one tube of white watercolor or white gouache, either one will work, and you put it out on your palette and mix it with your other colors. Because we're not trying to create a whole painting where we're using opaque paints, we're just trying to allow ourselves to put lighter color over darker color to test whether we wish we would have done it differently for planning purposes. So mostly what we're going to want is lighter versions of the colors we've already mixed in our painting, so we just add some white paint to those colors. And in this case, I decide those lighter areas are actually kind of distracting, and I would rather have them back to that sort of green color I had before. So I take some of my green and mix it with white and put it back in there. So basically, I'm letting myself do all my overworking on my planning draft, and I don't worry about trying to get my drawing exactly right or laboring over exactly what techniques I'm going to use for things like trees and grass and rocks and so forth. Especially since I don't want to spend a lot of time figuring out how I'm going to paint something if it turns out I'm not even going to include that shape. So suppose at this point I decide I like the way the shapes are arranged on the page. I'm pretty happy with the white shed being sort of a grayish color instead, so it doesn't jump out so much. So what I do is I look at all the places where I needed to use opaque paint, and that's where I either need to paint around that area or use masking fluid. So now we have a roadmap for how we're going to work from larger shapes down to finer detail and where we need to reserve our lights. So you might be thinking, I could have looked at the photo and figured out which things were white and just masked those to begin with. But remember, we don't want to assume that we're going to include everything we see in the photo. So our planning draft allows us to figure out what we actually want to include by starting with the larger shapes and adding more and more detail, and still figure out which of those details that we do add back might need to be masked in our final version. And we might have decided to add some light shapes that aren't in the photo for better design. And then in that case, we wouldn't know ahead of time to mask them. So the point of this is not just that it tells you where you want to reserve lights and whites. It also allows you to make those choices independent of what might be in your references. Okay, especially if you're new to watercolor, I'm sure your head is spinning a little bit. So let's take a deep breath and turn our attention to something that's a little bit easier to do, a little more playful and fun, but pays big dividends over the long run. So our third strategy is to explore our brush marks and try to build things from brush marks. So this is an example of what I mean by building things with brush marks. And I have several videos on doing brush drawing like this, and including one about this hummingbird. But what I didn't talk about in those videos is where this comes from. So I think what most people do, and what I started doing, was you see something out there in the world and you try to figure out how you can make it out of brush marks. And that can be really hard. So what I suggest you do is when you have a little bit of time in your studio, you're warming up, or especially when you get a new brush, play around with your brushes and just see what kind of shapes they'll make. And then see if you can use those shapes to build things. And then when you've built something, figure out where you might be able to use it. So something like this, I've used color here, but these could very well be good silhouettes to use in a silhouette painting. So a silhouette painting doesn't have to be a pencil drawing of the silhouette that you fill in with color. It could be brush marks that you make wet, or in this case with pale colors, so you can see what I'm doing, using the shapes that your brush naturally makes to build something, and then dropping in colors and letting them mingle with one another until you have filled a silhouette, and the silhouette basically carries the idea. So of course you could also trace the silhouette of the iris and drop your colors in, but if you do have something that you can build with brush marks, then you don't have to have any pencil lines. And that also means that you don't really need to put in a background. These little brush drawing silhouette paintings have a lovely freshness that shows off the watercolor, and you really don't need to add a background to them. So this is another way you can design a very simple painting of your own. This would make a wonderful greeting card. So there you go, 3 simple strategies that you can use right away to start designing paintings of your own, even if you just started out. Keep it simple, but these strategies can grow with you as you develop skill and develop practice in planning. You can start to add a little more complexity and a little more. If it gets to be too much, back it off. And if you need a quick card for somebody or a postcard when you're sketching on location, these 3 strategies can really help you design something quickly that's not too complicated to paint in a fairly short period of time. So I hope you have fun with it, and I'll see you next time. Happy painting.